Thank you so much for coming to this breakout session today. My name's Monique Alfris and I'm Head of Market Transformation at NABERS. I'm soon going to be acting in the co-director role at NABERS. I'm also the mother of Evie, so if you've seen my little baby here today, I'm often known as Evie's carer. If you've got any baby questions, happy to take them after the session. We've got such an interesting session here today, not least because of some of the announcements that we've heard this morning as well. We're going to give you an update on some of the latest cutting-edge policy developments. We're going to hear from 4 really inspiring speakers about the work that they've been doing. They're each going to share work which has really been setting the standard for policy making across the country, so we'll have some questions for them afterwards as well on what they're talking about, provided that we have everything running on time. If you've got any questions for the panel, you can submit them via our Events Air platform, and I'm just going to read from my notes here so that you know what you need to do. If you're joining the session online via the virtual portal, you can log your questions on the right-hand side of the screen. If you're here in the room, you can use the attendee app. You can log your questions via the session tab in the app. Or if you're in the room, we have our roving mics, Carmen and Gemma down the back, so you can just put up your hand and they'll come around and get your questions. We'll try and fit in as many as possible. But I just wanted to start our session today just spotlighting a few things that maybe aren't going to come up in the rest of the conference that really deserve a bit of a shout out and a mention. The first one is particularly dear to my heart. So NABERS published our 2024 Sustainable Portfolio Index earlier this year, and it came with a very special edition. The Victorian Health Building Authority chose to publicly disclose the NABERS and energy water ratings of 133 Victorian public hospitals. That's right, almost 2.9 million square metres of public infrastructure now has a public disclosure of its energy and water performance, setting a real benchmark for public health infrastructure across the country. It's just such a phenomenal achievement and really needs to be applauded. And I wanted in particular, I know he's listening on the line, I wanted to call out Tiernan Humphreys for his long-term vision and dedication. This is one of those things that without a long-term champion, they're, year in, year out, helping us get through everything we needed to get through to make this happen. It never would have happened. So I'm hoping you can all join me in a round of applause. Just a couple of call outs from that disclosure. The average NABERS energy rating is 4.1 for energy and 3.9 for water. So that's something that the Victorian government has been working on over a period of time to lift up those numbers. 62% achieved above average ratings. We've got 3 that achieved a 6-star NABERS energy rating, 30 achieved 5 stars. For water, 13 achieved 6 stars, 29 achieved 5 stars. And the most incredible statistic for me out of all of this is that of all of the buildings in Victoria that were eligible for a rating, only 1 didn't get rated. Every single one of the rest of them got rated, and they're all available now online on our website, so anyone can go in and see and have a look at how they're performing. The other thing that I wanted to do a quick plug about was our soon-to-be released NABERS Policy Toolkit. So this is going to help policymakers when they're using NABERS to be able to achieve outcomes for the policies that they're making. It's not just for government policymakers, it's also for people that are working in corporates that are looking to set policy. You might want to use NABERS to drive purchasing, leasing and operating decisions. You might want to use it when you're designing new developments or within planning policy. So we're going to have a guide. This is something that's been called for industry for quite some time. So we're going to have a guide just to help you understand how you set targets, how you understand how many buildings there are in the market that have that particular star rating, and what's happening kind of across the country so that you can make sure that you're sort of at the level that you want to be at. That's going to come out soon, and a really big thank you to Bruce Precious on that one, who's done a lot of hard work. I need to plug a couple of other policy-related sessions that are going to be on today. So you may have some embodied carbon questions. There's going to be a session at 1:40 on that, one of the breakout sessions. And the other session, which I think David was plugging in his presentation as well, was at 2:30. We've got one on the National Construction Code 2025 public consultation. So if you've got some questions about that, there's a couple of good sessions to go along to. But now we're going to get into our session for today. So I'd like to introduce all of our speakers before letting them take it away. First of all, we've got Mel Dewsnap. She's Manager of Sustainability Programs at the City of Sydney and also a member of our National Steering Committee for many years, has provided her service and her expertise on that. We've got Anne Martinelli, who's Senior Policy Officer for Gas Reform at Victorian Government's Department for Environment, Land, Water and Planning. We've got Luke Delancey, who's the Director of Climate Change Action in Government Operations at the Federal Department of Finance, and he's dialing in remotely via Zoom, so you can give us a wave on your camera, Luke, you're up on screen. And Mara Putnis, we've got as Co-Director of Commercial Building Policy at the Federal Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. So now I'm going to hand over to Mel to get us started. Thanks very much.
Hi everyone, great to be here. I'll just get my slides going. So, as Monique said, I'm Mel Dewsnap, Manager Sustainability Programs at the City of Sydney, and I would also like to acknowledge that we are on Gadigal land today and pay my respects to elders present, past and emerging. So from a sustainability leadership perspective and a local government perspective, I'd like to start here. We are one of the hundreds of local governments in Australia that have declared a climate emergency in 2019. And this was on the back of ongoing calls from our community over more than a decade demanding that we take climate action at a city level. So our leadership in this space has quite a legacy and quite a history to it. And our community is constantly demanding that we increase what we do, and they want to be part of the solutions to the climate crisis, but also acknowledging the complexity of the affordability crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the merging of these and the challenges that we are all facing mean that local government, states, and the federal government are going to need to work together in ways we haven't before. So our overarching target for our local government area is net zero by 2035. So of course that is slightly ahead of some other jurisdictions, and that's really the driver for the engagement work that we do, the policy work that we shape, and the collaborations and partnerships that we drive. In our local government area and across metropolitan Sydney, of course, buildings are where the majority of our emissions are from. And we all spend around 90% of our time in buildings, whether it's work, play, at home, and we all interact in different ways with buildings, and we all need to make sure that our policy from a national and state level is really targeted and delivered in a locally relevant way, and that we need all parts of government to work together in that delivery. So next, just having a couple of slide challenges. I'll just keep going. We use a data-driven approach to everything that we do. So not just City of Sydney, but also across the Resilient Sydney, which is the 33 Sydney councils. We have what we call a net zero platform where we can see where all our emissions are coming from, and we can actually track and use that to play out different policy and engagement mechanisms and ensure that we're targeting our programs, our partnerships and our work appropriately. So here you can see overall, even with increases to GDP, population and employment, we have reduced our emissions by 41%, and this is on our trajectory to 70% reduction by 2030, on the way to net zero by 2035. And the important thing about this chart is it really just reflects the power of collective action and the power of partnerships and how we are working across our communities in a local way to drive change. We've brought in our net zero performance standards for new buildings, which is complementing and working with the new Sustainable Building SEP. And that really, at the time of development, was an example of city leadership where we knew that we could go beyond NCC 2019. We did the cost-benefit analysis. We did huge amounts of engagement to look at how we could step ahead. And hopefully this will be overlapped, soon as we move into NCC 2025. And again, we have to ratchet up our ambition and make sure that we have we are complementing that across all of our policy platforms. In regards to a couple of key partnerships that I wanted to highlight, the first one is the work we've done in the residential space. So local government, in regards to all of our policy and regulations, we can help inform that in the development, deliver that in locally place-based way. We have the highest residential density in Australia. So as the City of Sydney, we have a responsibility, and we work across metropolitan Sydney and with other Australian city governments to ensure that our data from the ground up is informing policy and actually getting best outcomes in terms of emission reductions, cost reductions, and community resilience outcomes. We know from our work with Class 2 apartment buildings that when we provide NABERS ratings with a complementary costed energy action plan, we can provide direction for owners' corporations to then invest in efficiency, invest in electrification, and on-site and off-site renewables on a trajectory to net zero. This sector is hugely complex. Anyone who lives in an apartment will be able to tell you that. Huge proportion of Australian cities are privately and collectively owned. For our local government area, we're at 80%. Greater Sydney will be 50% of people will live in apartments by 2040. So we're really pleased to see the work that's happening at a federal level and the work with many of you around the energy efficiency disclosure work, and particularly that there is a commitment to ensure that we have an apartments focused and tailored approach to policy and market levers to ensure that we get this part of the market right. There are huge cost savings to be realised. We know on average 30% reduction in emissions and water consumption is possible regardless of building age. We need to reflect that operational performance back into our planning system, our regulations, and we need disclosure to drive that change at scale. City Switch, we are very proud to work with other Australian cities, and we've got City of Melbourne here. We're really pleased to see this has been called out specifically in the National Energy Performance Plan to be scaled and a partnership with local government expanded across the country. City Switch captures 10% of Australian office space currently, and a huge diversity of sectors, businesses through to non-profits. We know that Australian businesses need support to get to net zero. So City Switch enables us to work with NABERS to build around that as the policy backbone and deliver nationally consistent campaigns to support Australian businesses to understand what are their scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, and how do they work systematically to get the benefits of decarbonising. I won't go through all of the achievements of our Better Buildings Partnership or our Sustainable Destination Partnership right now, but what I will say is these are fundamental to driving change across whole of the property market. The BBP has been operating for over 10 years and working not only with the largest real estate institutional owners, but NABERS and our supporting partners, has been foundational in the development of tools such as NABERS Waste, and also we're now seeing that evolution and leadership in circular economy and resilience. And finally, in the tourism space, Sydney is the gateway for tourism in Australia. We've got a fantastic, diverse number of players that are working together to decarbonise, and we need a lot more investment and a lot more help to go as fast as we need to. So looking at how do we leverage the partnerships, scale what we've all got so we can amplify action, address the climate emergency, and make sure that we get that local, place-based engagement happening alongside and to assist the delivery of larger scale national and state policy is fundamental, and we're really inspired and keen to continue to work with all of you, and we thank NABERS for its fantastic work and partnership with local government, and we look forward to the next 25 years. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Sorry, just firstly, I'm representing the Victorian Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action. That was probably my mistake for giving you the old name. Sorry, I'm just having trouble with, can't see the slide. Yeah, okay, great. Sorry, I need to go back. So, just a bit of context first. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with much of this, but the Victorian Government has set a net zero target of net zero emissions by 2045. And as has been mentioned several times already this morning, Victoria's reliance on fossil gas is a big contributor to Victoria's emissions, contributing 17% of our total emissions. So obviously reducing our heavy reliance on fossil gas is a key element of meeting our net zero by 2045 target. And you're obviously probably also aware that Victoria is a bit of an outlier in terms of how much fossil gas we use in our buildings. 50% of our gas is used in residential buildings and another 10% in commercial buildings. So buildings are really at the forefront of Victoria's strategy, the Victorian Gas Substitution Roadmap for getting Victoria off fossil gas. So the key strategy is electrification, as has been mentioned several times. Switching from fossil gas to electricity, particularly as we've also set a 95% renewable energy target by 2035, means that as our electricity is increasingly powered by renewable energy, switching to electricity is a great way of cutting emissions. We're also facing declining supply. So not only have we got some pretty time-limited constraints around meeting emissions targets, we're also facing a supply gap, which is making the task of needing to reduce our reliance even more urgent. I've just lost my slide on the front, thank you. Obviously, rising prices are another massive contributor to the pressures that we're facing in Victoria at the moment, and declining supply is only contributing to those rising prices that are a big contributor to cost of living issues. So, oh, that's a bit nasty colour, isn't it? So you're probably aware the first gas substitution roadmap was released in mid-July 2022. Since that first roadmap was released, a number of commitments and initiatives have been delivered. The Victorian Energy Upgrades Program, which is the flagship program for driving energy efficiency upgrades in Victoria, has been expanded to include new incentives for electrification and to remove some of the remaining incentives for switching to gas that were a legacy of earlier times. We've also made a couple of amendments to Victorian planning provisions. Firstly, to again try to remove some of those perverse incentives. We previously had a requirement for new developments to connect to the reticulated gas network. That was removed. And we've since gone further and announced in July 2023 that from the 1st of January this year, all new residential buildings requiring a planning permit would no longer be able to be or permitted to connect to fossil gas. So consistent with some of the points that Frankie was making in the plenary earlier, we're really needing to focus particularly on making sure that we're not expanding our retrofit program for the future, and really making sure that we're doing whatever we can to be encouraging new buildings to be built without fossil gas. An update to the gas roadmap was released in December 2023 with a series of new announcements and new commitments that are now being delivered in Victoria. Central to the work that we're doing at the moment is undertaking a regulatory impact statement, looking at options for starting to phase out. So firstly, to expand that all-electric requirement to a broader range of residential buildings beyond those that just require a planning permit, which is only a minority of new buildings built in Victoria. but also looking at what options there might be for starting to phase out gas in existing residential and some commercial buildings, or most commercial buildings. I should also say too that obviously we can't say much about what is going to be in that RIS till it's out, and we expect it to be out later in 2024, but we are really trying to work on the basis of, as was mentioned earlier this morning, noting the diversity of commercial buildings, the fact that it is very difficult to regulate a one-size-fits-all sort of solution to such a complex and diverse space, we are trying to keep everything on the table until there's a reason, a good reason to take it off the table. So we are trying to look as broadly and creatively as we can at that more complex commercial building classes. We have ruled out some sectors of the economy straight off the bat. We know that a lot of high temperature applications are difficult to electrify, so things like crematoriums and brickworks and a lot of agricultural and industrial applications are out of scope. We're looking at those easily and readily electrifiable applications, cooking, heating, hot water, in as many of Victoria's buildings as we possibly can. So in support of that, we've also recently launched an electrification grants program for large energy users, and that's really in recognition of a point that's come up a couple of times today about the fact that even just working out how to electrify a large building or a large energy using facility is complex, and working out the plan takes money. So these grants are really focused at helping those large energy users build those business cases and put together those plans so that we can start to drive solutions in some of those more complex and bespoke areas. We're also undertaking a review of the Victorian Energy Upgrades Program. It's been in place since 2008. The world has changed a fair bit since then, so this review is really going to be looking at how it's a market-based white certificate scheme, needs to perhaps evolve to keep it fit for purpose into the future, and particularly to support a focus on electrification. Minimum efficiency standards for rental homes is another major priority for the Victorian Government at the moment. We've just released a regulatory impact statement canvassing a range of options, and that consultation is open now until the 1st of July. And that again, I guess, is in recognition of the fact that it's going to take a whole lot of different pieces all working together to solve this complex problem. Programs like CBD, disclosure, very effective in a market where you've got reasonably, I don't know if the word's equal, but balanced power dynamics between tenants and building owners, where there are strong incentives on both sides. That's not always the case in the residential private tenancy market, and the Victorian Government, for that reason, feels like there's a real role for regulation to just mandate that buildings must, or if you want to lease a home, it must meet certain standards. So in 2021, basic health and safety standards were put in place. We're now moving to the next stage of looking at basic energy efficiency standards. And just lastly, you might be aware about the announcement in the most recent state election that the old State Electricity Commission would be revived and brought back and reinvigorated for a new century. So that work has been continuing, and we expect later this year that the SEC will be launching a pilot of a sort of one-stop shop consumer electrifications advice service to really help drive both community awareness, but also being able to turn that awareness into actual action and help people in a practical way navigate what can be often a pretty confusing and complex space. And so, yeah, I'd like to just thank the organisers once again for inviting me to speak about Victoria's attempts, I guess, you know, what we're doing at the moment in terms of contributing to the challenge that we all face in getting our buildings to net zero, which if the whole economy needs to be at net zero at least before 2050, if not earlier, then we've got a real opportunity for buildings to really be at the forefront of that, given that there are so many great opportunities that we could be acting on right now. So thanks again.
And now we've got Luke doing his presentation from the Federal Department of Finance. Can you hear us, Luke?
So thank you. I am Luke Delancey, and I am lucky enough to be a Director of Climate Action in Government Operations within the Federal Department of Finance. And I'm here today to talk to you about our current policies, targets, reporting and challenges. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Department of Finance has lead for our net zero target within government operations at a federal government level, but we are heavily supported by Department of Climate Change, specifically David Atkins and his team are invaluable to us achieving what we have done in the last 12 to 18 months and to our continued success. I'd also like to acknowledge the NABERS team, the Green Building Council team, and everybody that we've drawn inspiration from, as ultimately it's a combined effort for where we are and where we're going. We can go to the next slide. It should have background at the top.
Oh.
Excellent. So a bit of a refresh for everybody in the room and who's joining online. Australia is a party to the Paris Agreement, and within the Labor government's Powering Australia policy, they committed that they would take much more ambitious action on climate and set a target of 43% reduction in emissions by 2030 and net zero nationally by 2050. What they also included was that the Australian Public Service would lead by example and the public service would reach net zero by 2030. On coming into power, Prime Minister Albanese, Minister Bowen kept that promise and immediately wrote to the UNFCCC updating Australia's national determined contributions, and APS Net Zero 2030 is now included as a NDC item under the Paris Agreement. So the APS Net Zero unit was established in late 2022. We've recently evolved into the Climate Action in Government Operations unit. After we formed, we also facilitated Minister Bowen declaring Australia would join the Net Zero Government Initiative. So countries using their government operations to lead by example is not a novel approach. There are 23 countries led by the US in the NZGI initiative, all using their government operations to lead by example. I'm happy to say in the last 12 to 18 months, we have produced a net zero in government operations strategy, a summary roadmap of that strategy. We've reinstated annual reporting for the first time in 10 years in a consistent way, developing a framework to achieve that. And the reason that we've evolved into the Climate Action in Government Operations unit is, in addition to the APS Net Zero target and the whole of government reporting, we've also been tasked to tailor the work the Treasurer is undertaking in climate-related disclosures for an appropriate mechanism within the Commonwealth. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Luke.
So some of the targets I've already brushed over, but other targets which the Powering Australia policy set or that we've seen through the Pittsburgh Declaration and interface in our space include a commitment that 75% of Commonwealth fleet passenger vehicle orders will be low emission vehicles by 2025. There's some sub-targets on that with 25% by last year and 50% by this year, and I'm happy to say that we're meeting those. We're also made an aspirational target of 100% of our vehicles being zero emission vehicles in all classes by 2035. You'll see the federal government's also taking action within the Buy Australian plan, where we're using government power to take action on climate change and support energy projects. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Luke.
Great. So our strategy, which was co-created with all departments of state over the period of 12 months, where we pulled the senior executive into a room every 4 weeks until we reached consensus, has the current priorities for emission reduction in the following areas. We've got energy and buildings, and you're going to see why, and why NABERS requirements on office accommodation, warehouses, ICT, and travel accommodation is so important. But we also go into areas of procurement, fleet, travel, information and communication technology, and we touch on things like the capacity building and education that will be needed to improve the climate literacy across our public service so that we can meet the climate commitments that we've made. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Luke.
So if you do not want to read our 40-page strategy, and I find it absolutely enthralling, so I don't know why you wouldn't, you can, however, read the roadmap. So the roadmap is designed to be viewed on A3, and I say viewed on A3 because I don't like you printing, but it includes the highlights, and ultimately that was what we committed to the US and the other 23 countries we would produce in a 12-month period, and we launched that at the UN Conference of Parties last year. Next slide.
Thanks, Luke.
As well as the co-creation process where we engaged with all departments of state and peak bodies for consultation on what leadership looked like, it wouldn't have been appropriate for us to put a strategy together without having data to underpin that, and the reinstatement of public reporting for the first time in 10 years was a key enabler for us. Key takeaway from this slide, you will notice that electricity is the single largest source of CO2e emissions from the Australian Public Service, and to put that in perspective, it's larger than our military capability, so it's big. Next slide.
Thanks, Luke.
So challenges that we've faced and are continuing to face. Scope 3, let's face it, it's hard, but it's also where leadership is. And ultimately, we're expanding our reporting so that we can start to understand our supply chain and have informed conversations with government about what Scope 3 looks like. That includes delving into complex supply chains, for example, facilities management or construction, where you've got subcontract on subcontract and trying to obtain that data through the supply chain, but also going into multi-dimensional subcontract areas like ICT. And if we look at things like virtual servers or the emerging AI market, what does that look like? What share of those emissions is ours? We have integration into broader policy settings. So we've seen a raft of changes across government, and we are just one of the many policies that the government of today has picked up. So how do we integrate with that broader sustainable policy change? And how do we make sure we join up all of the different policies, strategies and documents required so that industry can work with us to meet our requirements? There are also a range of other challenges, such as the availability of emissions-related data and emerging technology and transition challenges. So that might be looking at electric vehicle charging infrastructure, but again, it also might be something like the emerging AI that is integrating into our business as usual. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Luke.
So I'm going to close there, but I again would like to reiterate my thanks to not only to Q and NABERS and the Green Building Council, but those who have inspired us to achieve what we have, and that includes both local, state and all interjurisdictional governments who have taken action. I also think that private industry and our not-for-profit sector have been leading in this space for some time. So we have achieved a significant amount in the last 12 to 18 months. It has been through collective effort with our own individual implementation. And I will pass over to the next presenter there.
Thanks so much, Luke.
Hello everyone, and thanks Luke. So my name's Putnis. I'm from the Commonwealth Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. So, not surprisingly, I'm the person that manages the CBD operations team and the CBD policy. So I'll be spending my full 5 minutes on expansion of the CBD program. So as you heard in the previous Commonwealth update session and from Luke just now, there's a significant number of policies and strategies at the federal level, either completed or underway, focused and coordinated on contributing to the target of net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So yes, I'm going to use the focus of my presentation to focus on the Commercial Building Disclosure Program and how that can play a greater role in achieving our 2050 emissions target. So not many people know, but in 2022, the Building Energy Efficiency Disclosure Act, which is the act that underpins the CBD program, was amended to be clear that the objective of the act is to contribute to the achievement of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. So, in order for the program to play a greater role in driving emissions reduction, we're doing some further policy thinking around what an expanded program might look like, the benefits and challenges of expanding the CBD program, and how a more comprehensive program would assist other initiatives and policies at the local, state and federal level. So as you heard, and at the risk of repetition, consultation's open, so have your say. It's on the screen now. So for those of you who are not familiar with the program, I'll quickly run through it. Most of you are. So it really is a mandatory disclosure program with two key obligations. One, there's an obligation to obtain a building energy efficiency certificate before you sell or lease your office building or office space. And this certificate comprises of the NABERS energy rating and a separate tenancy lighting assessment. And 2, you need to display that NABERS energy rating in any advertising of the property for sale or lease. So our accredited assessors undertake ratings and they're independently verified by government. So at the moment, the program only applies to office buildings over 1,000 square metres and where the total office space in the building is 75% or more by net lettable area. The CBD program, it's a relatively light touch regulatory program. It really just requires the mandatory provision of information, but it can be powerful. So it doesn't really mandate particular energy upgrades, but it does empower people to make their own decisions by providing really high quality information and data about the energy performance of buildings. So mandatory disclosure of energy ratings of commercial buildings has been very successful. It's correlated with significant improvements in energy efficiency and emissions reduction, as others have pointed out this morning. So we know it works for offices. So what do we need to do to make it work for other building types? The feasibility study we've published today includes a suggested roadmap for introducing mandatory disclosure to most major commercial building sectors by 2035. The roadmap's up on the screen now. The final might look quite different to this, and this is why we're going out to consultation. However, the following principles underpin the roadmap. 1, prioritising early expansion to larger commercial building types where NABERS ratings tools already exist and are available. 2, pursuing coverage of all significant commercial building sectors over time, eventually covering a large proportion of their emissions and energy use with effective regulation. 3, phasing in the use of minimum energy performance standards, or MEPS, to building types that have first been subject to disclosure. And 4, specific details on timing, size, thresholds, trigger points, and other specific implementation details to be done following more cost-benefit analysis and regulatory impact statements and further industry consultation. So we are seeking feedback on the above roadmap, noting that implementing CBD expansion will require further analysis of the costs and benefits. In addition to expanding to additional building types, because that's probably the main thing we see on the screen here, key aspects of the program we're interested in receiving feedback on, in addition to the sectors, are views on what energy and emissions information should be disclosed. So currently, BEAC, so the certificates include the building's NABERS energy rating and the tenancy lighting assessment, the TLA. So we're really interested in the usefulness and necessity of the TLA and the benefits of requiring disclosure of any other emissions or energy information. So examples include Scope 1 emissions, so from on-site activities such as gas use, diesel use or refrigerants, and renewable energy use. We're also really interested in your views on the future use of minimum energy performance standards to improve the energy efficiency of any commercial buildings that don't really respond to disclosure. So minimum energy performance standards, or MEPS, could require specific buildings to meet base level requirements such as a particular star rating by a specified date in the future. So what could it look like in practice? Perhaps a hotel would be required to obtain a NABERS rating every 3 years, display that NABERS rating in online advertisements. Perhaps we use the NABERS co-assess tool that is supported by new regulations and require whole office building ratings. Perhaps the NABERS renewable energy target is a mandated piece of information to be on the certificates. So it's all up for discussion, and I encourage you to have your say. So, thank you.
I'm told that we have time for a couple of questions, if I'm still getting a thumbs up the back before we head off to lunch. So I think I might start with a quick one. Are there any hands up in the audience yet? Oh, we've got one down here. Okay, we'll go to that question first, see what we've got in the audience.
Hi, I'm Jack from the City of Melbourne, Zero Carbon Buildings Officer. My question's for Mara. Can you clarify what you mean by the minimum energy performance standards for offices and what that would look like and how that's different to the disclosure requirements?
Yeah, so thanks, Jack. So it's actually a bit of a different change because the Act is called the Building Energy Efficiency Disclosure Act, so it's really a different concept other than mandatory disclosure of information. We're really seeking views on how we could lift the minimum standard of buildings and somehow, lift up those poor performing buildings that don't respond to disclosure. So it's not something that we're going to introduce right away. It's not going to be, a really, strict level that's going to be very burdensome at the moment. But how do we actually introduce the concept to people in terms of, being required, because it is a regulatory program, how in time can we make buildings required to meet a specified rating in the future by a specified date. So that may be the star rating, it might be some other type of kind of base level that the government agrees on, but it's really putting the concept out there to really notify people that yes, great mandatory disclosure is a really great thing, we should really be expanding it to other building types. But for those building types that really don't respond to mandatory disclosure, and there's other, we've heard there's all types of different types of motivations of building owners and managers, how can we introduce that concept and really get a view, an industry view, going to be a whole type of different views about this, and start the conversation about it, basically.
Great. All right, well, I've got a question from online that I'm going to go to, so we'll just see who in the panel might want to take this one. It's a very good question, which is that when we're looking at making our buildings go to all electric, we really need to think about the costs of expanding the electricity supply infrastructure, the substations and the peak demand pricing, and the fact that when we go to all electric buildings, there are some challenges around peak demand. Is that something that any of you have grappled with the policies that you're working on, and what's your sort of response from a policy point of view? I know there's been a bit of work at City of Sydney.
Yeah. For our apartment buildings, we're doing some research at the moment where we're actually looking at, well, what does a future state look like where buildings and cars, in effect, are becoming part of inner city grids? So how do we model out and support our high density communities around the uptake of EVs, but do that in a way in the broader context of the electrification of those buildings holistically? And we know from that, the modelling that we're doing right now, that the importance of energy efficiency is absolutely foundational, and also smart demand management. And we're really going to have to support communities to be able to do that in a way so we're not just driving up costs or locking in new 12-month long demand charges because new peaks are being reached. We need to make sure that's done in a way that's going to deliver not only emissions reduction, but also sustainable grid outcomes and also fair and inclusive community outcomes as well. So that's definitely an area in Australian cities that we're going to have to make sure that we get right, and that we're data-led, we make sure we understand the buildings, and we work together across all levels of government to incentivise and use the right market levers to drive change in the right direction.
And I love that language that you guys have been using as well around the building as an energy system. So when you're making one change, you're not just talking about putting a heat pump in, you're thinking about the impact that whole building is going to be having, and the fact that if it's an apartment building, it is going to need to get EVs into it down the line. So are you thinking about that as you're doing your other upgrades as well?
That's right. And future-proofing, there's a lot happening at once, but we have to look at that holistically. Otherwise, we may go down a path of unintended consequences, and we also need to be sharing those learnings so that we can get the right support for our owners' corporations and make sure that our inner city grids are dynamic and flexible, and we are actually running efficient buildings on renewables into the future.
Any takers?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit from the Victorian perspective. Obviously, given our high reliance on gas and our big electrification challenge, this is very front of mind for us and something that comes up often. So firstly, in terms of actual capacity of our electricity grid to cope with electrification, we're confident that it can, because our peak electricity demand at the moment occurs in summer. We have a big gap between that and winter, and given that the majority of our gas consumption is for winter heating, we're confident that really electrification is basically just going to bring us up to something similar to our current summer peaks. But as Mel's alluded to, really the real challenge is more about time of use and managing both the distributed production and the distributed consumption of electricity across the system. At the same time as we have people concerned about peak demand, we actually have minimum demand challenges that are actually coming at us faster. And so all of that, that home optimisation opportunities, thinking about how EVs, which are basically just home batteries on wheels, get integrated into the system, thinking about where they're likely to be charging and discharging in the system, you know, at home or at work, different times of the day. That's all the really fun stuff that you know, I guess we're grappling with as a government, so that we can be confident that the system is there ready to, well, not just cope with electrification, but that we're getting all of those, basically, as we Mel sort of alluded to, energy or electricity is not a thing in itself, it's providing services. And so I think the way we're providing those services is going to continue to change, and we want to make sure that it's delivering for business and residential consumers of that electricity.
How are we going? One more question? Okay, I do, so can I do one more question and key takeaway? No, yes, okay. There was a question here in the audience. Did you still want to ask your question? Anybody else in the audience with a quick question? No? Going once? Going twice?
Thank you. Carl Perkins, Department of Climate Change, the Environment, Energy and Water, Federal. I just have a question. As someone who used to work in the hospitality industry, I understand that the hospitality industry has a strong reliance on gas. How do we intend to kind of work with the hospitality industry to electrify particularly restaurants?
I may as well take that one. So I alluded to the regulatory impact statement process that we're in the middle of at the moment. Obviously looking at retail premises, you know, a big focus for that is residential buildings, obviously. You know, a big chunk of Victoria's gas use and the real low-hanging fruit opportunities are in residential buildings. We want to make sure that we're you know, doing what's obvious first. Then the question is, okay, so then what's next? And office buildings where, you know, that gas use might be for heating or hot water, again, where there might be readily available electric alternatives that make sense. Okay, let's look at that. We recognise that there are whole parts in the ecosystem or the system that are more complicated and that in some cases might need more bespoke solutions. Hospitality is definitely one of them. Hospitals is another. And so there's a lot of work and conversation going on at the moment about what the most appropriate response to that is. We're looking in this RIS at what the regulatory options might be. Obviously, regulatory options are just one tool in the toolkit. So I think the simplest way to answer that question is wait to see what happens, you know, wait to see what's in and out when the RIS comes out. But we feel like the very process of having gone through the process of I guess explicitly saying we are looking at electrifying everything that we can, also encourages people to start looking at the opportunities that they might have. And so we recognise that cooking is something that is not just a technical challenge, it's a cultural challenge, both in homes and in hospitality situations. You can't just change things overnight when you've got a cultural shift that you've got to encourage as well. So I think what we're really aiming to do is to use some of the policy processes that we're delivering now as a way of just continuing to have the conversation with Victorian people about, oh, there are actually electric alternatives. Have you tried an induction cooktop? Oh, actually it's quite good. It's completely different to previous, you know, people's experience of electric cooking. That's not going to happen overnight, but yeah, I'm not sure if that's answered your question. It's complicated, but I think
Lots
we're
of thinking
recognising
going
there's
into it.
often a
Yeah.
bit more of a cultural connection than there might be, say, with hot water.
Yep. Well, I think that we might...
Oh, sorry, that answer was way too long, wasn't
No,
it?
it was good. I think that you covered it, and I think as well saying, you know, the fact that you're looking into it and we need to look at the opportunities, and it's going to be different for each sector
Yeah,
as to what
that's right.
the challenges are going to be. You know, apartment buildings, it's going to be, you know, maybe more electric vehicles. They do have cooking there, but cooking's going to be a real focus for retail. So needing to look at each of the sectors and seeing what their challenges are and then working with them on that makes sense to me. I do think we're standing in between everyone and lunch, so we might do one very quick takeaway from each of you. Something that you're dying to make sure that, it's been quite a long session, a lot of information. If there's one thing you really want the audience to take away from your presentation today, what is it? Do we still have Luke on the line?
No, they do, yes.
I'm going to start with you, Luke. What's something that you'd like the audience to take away from today?
I think look, net zero is a collective problem with individual implementation, and the federal government can't achieve success without the people in the room, the people online, the people on the panel. Come and have a chat to us in the booth, send us an email. I'm always happy to talk to anyone who's silly enough to talk to me about net zero and can't do this practically.
It is a collaborative effort. Thank you, Luke. Mara?
Oh yeah, mine's quite simple as well. Please have your say. It really is all up for discussion now, the expansion of the CBD program. You don't have to do a really complex submission. You know, there's a simple survey. If you go there, it takes like 5 minutes. So if you're so inclined, you could do the survey or do a lovely submission. Thank you.
Thanks, Mara. Anne?
I think, you know, we've talked a lot about how we're halfway to through this decade to 2030. You know, buildings are standing for a long time. They're long-lived assets. So really, 2050 or 2045 is now, really. And given, even with the best intentions, how things can take time in a policy process, from a government policy process, I mean, really, the 2050 is not in the future, it's right now.
And I would say I'm really excited about how we're going to work together in new ways as different levels of government, and city governments and local government have such a key role to play in regard to delivering that very local engagement. We're going to need so many messengers, we're going to need new alliances, and we're going to need to leverage all of the collective power that we have to have a conversation with Australians across all sectors to really accelerate climate action. So we know that the Australian government committed to that at COP, as did many other nations, around looking at new ways that we can engage cross-government agencies. And I think that's going to be a challenge for us. There's so much good work to build on, but we're really going to have to accelerate that, and we don't have a lot of time. So scaling and using the partnerships, the networks, the things we've got established now to wrap around new policy, to help to get that out, to communicate together, to simplify our messages and drive that change home is more essential than ever.
I guess an observation from me is I've been away for 8 months on parental leave, just coming back, and I have to say I'm blown away by all of the things that we've talked about on this panel. Even just one person talking, I mean, the things that we've been able to achieve in that amount of time, that's the pace that we're going to need to continue to work at, like you said, halfway to 2030 to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. But we are getting there. We're making good progress, and it is, a lot of thanks to those that are in the room, also those that are on the panel. Thank you so much for coming along and sharing that with us today. I just feel super chuffed, super chuffed to have you all here and to hear about all the great work you're doing. And thank you for sharing with the room as well.